the alchemy of sex and spirit, where psychology, sexuality, and consciousness meet. In this episode, I'll speak of sex magic. And stay until the end for today's magical practice. It might just change everything. What comes to your mind when you hear of sex magic? Do you think of orgies, weirdos, or satanic cults? Do you wonder what on earth sex magic is, what it means? If you think any of those things, you're certainly not alone. When almost anybody in this day and age hear that phrase, it usually provokes a reaction. Images and ideas of something taboo, secret, weird, outrageous. So what actually is sex magic? Now, this is where I'm going to sound really annoying, because in truth, absolutely nobody can clearly define exactly what it is. It isn't simply a ritualistic method of having sex, although some ritual can be employed to heighten the sense of sacredness around sex. But in the same way that sacred magic itself isn't the same as stage magicians pulling rabbits out of a hat, sex magic isn't about wishing for something to happen, then having sex in order to get what you wish for. Sacred magic has been defined as the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. In other words, for transformation or change to take place in the circumstances of your life through the agency of your will or power to choose. So one way of defining sex magic, therefore, is the science and art of causing change to occur through the agency of sexual practices. Or expressed a slightly different way, sex magic is the conscious use of sexual energy, arousal, and creative erotic imagination to bring about transformation in consciousness, conditioning, or life circumstances. You may yourself have noticed that at certain moments in your intimate life, your whole sense of being changes. Intense desire, moments of creative urgency. In those moments, it feels as if everything is concentrated. Your thinking falls away. Something opens, and you begin to suspect this is special. This is the doorway to something or even someone else beyond the me that I think I am. I've known many men and women who are very socially awkward, paralyzingly shy, even physically disabled, and they come alive in intimacy, like somebody else stepped out of their body and displayed a sophistication and power that they never knew or believed existed. So you begin to pay special attention to this change of consciousness that intimacy and sex brings about. You notice that when sexual arousal rises, consciousness changes, time evaporates, images become vivid. It's as if your psyche becomes like metal in a furnace, capable of being shaped. So you seek out those who understand this, and this leads you to certain specific teachers. The first notable teacher of sex magic in the West was Pascal Beverly Randolph, a medical doctor and also a pioneering 19th century American occultist. He taught that sex energy is the most powerful natural force, and it could be harnessed for spiritual, mental, and physical empowerment through specific controlled sexual practices that he called sexual gnosis or fluidic techniques. He explained to his students how to hold sexual arousal and intention steadily in order to achieve specific desired results, how to unite desire with imagination, how to let orgasm implode inward rather than explode outward, so that energy is driven back through the nervous system and into consciousness. And when this is done correctly, changes occur, confidence grows, creativity intensifies. Sex magic treats sexual energy as a force to be deliberately directed towards a defined transformation, psychological, spiritual, or material. Sex magic always asks, what changes as a result of this act? In more modern times, two of the most notable and some might say notorious authoritative teachers of sex magic were Samael Aun Weor in Latin America and the English occultist Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley was one of the most influential and controversial figures in modern Western esotericism. He was a poet, mountaineer, magician, and spiritual teacher, and the central figure behind the philosophy of Thelema, summarized in his famous doctrine, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." By this, Crowley didn't mean self-indulgence, but the discovery and fulfillment of one's true will, the deepest purpose of the soul. Within his system of ceremonial magic, sexuality occupied a central place as a potent means of concentrating consciousness, directing intention, and accessing altered states of awareness. In Crowley's teachings on sex magic, sexual arousal and orgasm were understood as moments of extraordinary psychic and spiritual intensity. He taught that at the peak of sexual excitation, the ordinary thinking mind becomes suspended, allowing intentions, symbols, or magic formulas to be impressed directly upon the deeper layers of consciousness. Now, Crowley's work remains controversial, partly because of his provocative style, language, and personal excesses, and partly because his teachings were often presented in deliberately obscure forms. For serious students, his contribution lies less in imitation of his lifestyle, more in his systematic attempt to integrate sexuality, will, imagination, and spiritual practice into a coherent, magical psychology. Crowley was interested most of all in will, in discovering what he called true will, the deepest purpose of the soul, and learning how to align one's life with that. For him, sexual arousal and orgasm created a very unusual psychological moment, a moment when the ordinary thinking mind briefly collapses, defenses soften, self-consciousness drops away, and attention becomes intensely focused. And in that moment, he believed, intention could be planted very deeply into the psyche. So in Crowley's system, sex becomes a kind of ritual technology, desires cultivated, imagination's sharpened, and climax acts as a catalyst. Samael Aun-Weor was born in Colombia in 1917 and became one of the more unusual and influential spiritual teachers of the 20th century. He wrote an extraordinary number of books, more than 60, and devoted his life to what he saw was a very practical question. How does a human being actually wake up from mechanical living and become conscious? He called his approach universal Gnosticism, and it drew freely from many traditions: Christianity, Buddhism, Kabbalah, Tantra, and Western esotericism, not as ideas to believe in, but as tools for inner change. What mattered most to him was lived experience. He was far less interested in theory than in whether people were genuinely transforming their awareness, their emotions, and their way of being in the world. His position was uncompromising. Sexual energy is the same force that creates life, sustains nature, and animates consciousness itself. It's not symbolic. It's not metaphor. It's literal. His first major book, called The Perfect Matrimony, appeared in Colombia in 1950. It was the first time he'd spoken openly and publicly about the spiritual dimension of sexuality and what he called sexual transmutation. And this is where something important becomes clear, because sex magic, in the way he understood it, and in the way many traditions understand it, has very little to do with morality. It's not about being good or bad. It's not about purity versus sin. It's not about shame or virtue. It's about direction, about what happens to sexual energy once it's awakened. Is it scattered? Is it compulsive? Is it unconscious? Or is it gathered, understood, and integrated into a person's deeper life? Sexual force can be discharged, or it can be contained and circulated. Discharge is familiar to us. It's what most of us were trained into without ever being taught what it costs. Containment, on the other hand, is almost entirely absent from modern sexual education, and yet everything turns on it. What matters is not what we tell ourselves we're doing, but what is actually happening in the body, the nervous system, and the psyche. His teaching emphasizes transformation. He taught that sexual energy is the raw material of spiritual awakening, but only if it's conserved and refined. In The Perfect Matrimony, he speaks of sexual union without ejaculation as a path of transmutation. For him, sex magic isn't about manifesting outcomes, it's about dissolving ego, purifying the psyche, and awakening creativity and consciousness. His approach is more disciplined, more ascetic, more explicitly ethical, and for many people today, parts of it feel overly rigid. But behind it is a serious question. What happens when sexual energy is cultivated rather than constantly discharged? He denounced Crowley's teachings as black magic because Crowley didn't advocate containment, but instead, from Samael Aun-Weor's perspective, taught sex magic while spilling the seed. From the perspective of Gnosticism, presence matters more than outcome. Any transformation that occurs through sex magic is a byproduct, not a target. The variations and distinctions are not actually separate paths. They reflect various phases of one path, the art and science of sex magic. Different languages, different cultures, different styles, but all trying to understand the same mystery. What happens when sex is approached consciously? Each of these traditions carries wisdom, and each carries shadows. Perhaps now you'll understand a little more why I said at the beginning of this episode that there's no one definitive definition of sex magic. The minute one thinks they've discovered it, they've immediately lost the magic. On one thing, however, all the old and current practitioners of sex magic agree. Sex energy leads to higher and greater levels of creativity. Sex energy isn't neutral. It always does something. Sex magic begins with this premise. Sex itself isn't just a creative force. It's the creative force. It's the one thing from which everything and everyone comes into being. From the lowest insect to the most intelligent mathematician or scientist. Sex magic isn't about simply getting what you want. It's about becoming the kind of person for whom different things become possible. It's not manipulation, it's participation in the creative cosmic intelligence. Over time, results appear, not always dramatically, but unmistakably. Old blocks loosen, relationships shift, synchronicities multiply. One becomes clearer about purpose because something has been changed at the source. And this is why every serious esoteric tradition guarded this knowledge, not because it's shameful, but because it's so powerful, because it works. There is no spiritual path that can ultimately bypass sex. Sooner or later, all inner work passes through the sexual center. The body isn't an obstacle to sex magic, it's where the work happens. The flesh isn't something to overcome, it's something to inhabit consciously. When sex is approached as magic, it actually stops being a tool for getting what we want and becomes a force that changes who we are. The real question isn't whether sex is magical. The question is whether we relate to that force consciously. That is sex magic, and that's where the real work begins. Magical practice. This practice is adapted from a book called Making Love by Barry Long. It's intended primarily for couples, but if you don't currently have a partner, follow the practice for yourself and let love find you by magic. Sit together or alone if you aren't in a relationship and meditate upon this. If you're going to bring love and sex into your life, you're going to need new energy. And that energy starts with honesty. Honesty to yourself and honesty to life. Listen to yourself admit that your love life is not good enough. You must express this. Say it aloud. Hear it so that there's no hiding. no psychological escaping. It's not enough just to know it inside. That's how love dies between lovers. They think it's enough to know that they love inside and not to say it anymore. When it's too late, they sob and scream their need for love, but the door's already slammed. The house is empty. Say it now, so that your whole being hears it. Our lovemaking is not good enough. Next, admit to yourself that you don't know what to do about the problem, that you feel powerless. See that all that you can do is to repeat the same old actions, and that you're now in desperation and despair. Be honest. If you already know what to do to reignite love and sex into your life, then why haven't you acted? Why really are you still here? Finally, admit that you can't do it alone, that you need help. But when you give up denying the truth, when you truly surrender in humility, help is always there within you. And then it can appear outside you. If you've enjoyed this episode, you can download my free ebook, The 7 Stages of Love. Just follow the link in the description or comments section below. And until next time, take these words of Lon Milo Duquette from his book Sex, Magic, Tantra and Tarot away with you. Each of us has a secret lover, an ideal lover who has adored us since the beginning of our individual existence and who will never abandon us until the instant we merge our being in absolute Godhead. Thank you for listening. I'm David Brown, and this is the Alchemy of Sex and Spirit.